going to speak mostly about the impacts of climate change. I'm going to talk a lot about adaptation, and that's where the economics comes in. A lot of the other stuff is biology and agronomy, chemistry and physiology and that sort of stuff, and even a bit of physics. And I'm going to talk about that in these 5 chapters. Then we're going to talk about the reading for this week, the North European Enclosure Dam, and then, unlikely, if time permits, I'm going to do a little bit of valuation stuff that we won't cover about valuation this week. I will cover next week when we talk about the economic impacts of climate change. So that is the plan. We are here in the sequence. So we completed the section on greenhouse gas emission reduction, what does it cost, what do we need to do as a regulator to bring this about. The next couple of weeks we're going to talk about why do we think climate change is a problem. And then in the third block we're going to talk about climate policy. We're going to do a cost-benefit analysis and then some game theory and some definitions of welfare there. Right, so that's the plan, that's where we are. But today I'm going to talk mostly about why do we think climate change is a problem. And I'm going to talk about first some of the main concerns that people have, and that is what climate change will do to nature. So climate were to change, and everything that depends on climate were to change with it, right? So when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about changes in temperature, obviously warming. We're talking about changes in rainfall. But of course the driver of it all is changes in atmospheric composition, and it also has a direct effect on plants and on plants. And besides temperature and rainfall, there's of course also radiation and cloudiness and wind and what have you. Now this obviously has an immediate impact on nature. If you drive south from Brighton to say Naples or further down into Italy, you would notice that the vegetation is different, right? Climate is different, it's warmer, it's typically drier, definitely in summer. And that means that different plants grow there. And it's not just that some plants do better or not so well out there. Also everything that feeds on those plants, or everything that competes with those plants that do particularly well or not so well, would be affected too, right? So some plants are directly affected, other plants are affected through competition. And then the animals that feed on those plants would be affected too, including the animals that feed on those animals that feed on those plants, right? So you set in motion the chain of effects. And of course some of these animals that feed on those animals that feed on those plants are used to spread the seeds of those plants, right? So it sets in motion a whole chain of events. And you could expect that in a different climate you would see a completely different nature. That is shown in this graph, which is a particularly bad graph, I think, but it's the best I could find. What you're looking at here is a map of the world, obviously, and the darker the color, the greater the change, or rather, the greater the probability of change. So what you're looking at is a map of models agreeing on what climate change would do to nature, which is not the same as the probability of occurrence, but you can sort of pretend that it is for a while. And it's not observations, it's model projections, right? The thing that I don't really like about the graph is that what it shows is a biome shift, or rather the model agreement on the biome shifting. Now what is a biome? A biome is not the way nature looks or anything like that, but it is, it's nothing to do with species extinction or anything like that. A biome is the savanna, and the rainforest is a biome, and the northern forest is a biome, right? So what does this mean? This essentially means that what we have here is taiga at the moment, and there's basically 100% probability of a biome shift. That means that the taiga will be replaced with boreal forest. Right? So it's not some small change in the way the landscape looks, but you essentially go from the barren landscape that is dominated by moss and similar plants, and it will turn into forest. Right? Similarly here, a biome change would mean that the Amazonian rainforest is replaced by savanna. Right? So that is what you're looking at. Now what you see is that change is likely and change is widespread, right? So nature would look completely different in 100 years' time from now. The question is, of course, what do we think about this? Do we think this is good? Do we think this is bad? Is this an improvement? Is there deterioration? Or do we simply not care, right? Would we simply not notice? And the jury on that is still out. So what you see out there, if you walk towards the restaurant, is an elm tree, or rather a dead elm tree. Elm trees are magnificent trees. They used to dominate the landscape here. There used to be plenty of elm trees here, and they were really, really noticeable. And they all died in the 70s because of, well, actually a bit before that, because of a particular disease, nothing to do with climate change, but had to do with spread of the Dutch elm disease, because it was first discovered in the Netherlands, not because the Dutch invented it. And it led to a wholesale change in the landscape. Those trees that your grandparents thought of as majestic and very important in the landscape are simply not there anymore. And you guys grew up without elm trees, and you do not know any better that the best thing we had about elm trees is, or the closest thing we have to the elm trees is some dead remnants of trees, right? And you may not miss that, right? Similarly for the dodo, right? One of the iconic extinct species. Do you lie awake at night because the dodo is no longer there? Chances are not, right? So things will be completely different in the future in terms of nature, but the question is, will we notice, will we care? So that is major changes. Things will be different. We can put a little bit more structure on that, and that is that those plants that are currently hanging on to their existence because they're at the margin of their ecological niche, it's just warm enough for them to grow, or just wet enough for them to grow. Those plants will actually strive in the future, right? If it's just warm enough now, in the future it will be warmer, so they will do better. Similarly, if it's just cool enough for them to grow, then likely, most likely they will go extinct, at least locally, right? So plants and animals that are sort of at the margins of their existence either will disappear in that locality or will expand very, very rapidly. So that is something that we can say. And another thing that we can say is that specialists are likely to suffer much more than generalists. So there's certain species that you can find basically anywhere, and those species, because you can find them anywhere, that means that they can cope with a large range of different climates. They are likely to do fine, right? Because the future climate will be something that they have experienced already or are experiencing currently. Whereas those plants that are confined to a particular climate niche, particular ecological niche, are likely to disappear because that niche disappears from under them. And one example that I used to talk about is edelweiss that you see here, that in nature is only found high up in the Alps, and that is not because edelweiss can't grow anywhere else. You can go to any garden center and buy edelweiss and grow it in your garden. Edelweiss can basically grow anywhere, it just can't compete with other plants. Edelweiss grows slower and it would be completely overwhelmed by other plants very rapidly and die because of a lack of sun and water and other nutrients. Now the reason that edelweiss does well high up in the mountains is because other plants can't grow there. It basically has to do with the radiation that you have there. It's a much thinner atmosphere high up in the mountains, so much high dose of radiation, and that would kill most plants. But not edelweiss. Edelweiss can also cope with having 1 or 2 meters of snow dumped on it, right? Which is actually pretty tough if you're a small little plant, right? So a plant like edelweiss would be in trouble in nature because if it would need to migrate northwards, where would it go, right? In order to get from the mountaintop to the next mountaintop, it would need to travel through the valley, and it can't compete through the valley. And of course the problem with the Alps is also that north of the Alps there's the German plain, right? And the next mountain range is all the way in Norway. So if it wants to travel north, actually it's no north. Mountain is north. It may be getting to, and that is why I said I used to talk about this, and this the Vietnamese golden cypress is actually a better example of this. This is a recently discovered plant in 2001, but this time here. This is a very specific ecological niche. So it needs the limestone, otherwise it won't grow. But if it's too cold, it won't grow. If it's too hot, it won't grow either. So for the cypress to adapt to climate change, what it would need to do is move to the next limestone mountain range where the temperature is just exactly right for it. Right? So this tree would be in trouble in the wild. They've actually successfully grown it in, can you call it captivity? For a tree, right? So from the wild it may well disappear because it gets too hot in the place where it is now, right? So we can talk about these things, and a lot of people would be worried about these things. But I think you're perfectly right there. Because this tree has obviously evolved over a long period of time and has obviously withstood climate changes in the past. Ecologists and biologists don't have, I think, a proper grip on these methods still. But this is something that concerns a lot of people. Let's move to something we understand better. So when I say that plants directly depend on the weather and the climate and are immediately affected by climate change, that is true for unmanaged ecosystems we call nature, but it's of course also true for managed ecosystems, what we typically call farms. They would be affected as well. What you're looking at here is, and as I said, we understand this a lot better because it directly concerns us, right? Because this is the stuff that feeds us. So there's been many studies of what climate change will do to crops. And what you're looking at here is a summary of the evidence of the latest IPCC report. The next IPCC report will, I think, come out next year, maybe the year after. But this is the 2014 report. 2014. So it's slightly older material, but the picture hasn't changed as far as I know. So what you're looking at is a lot of information. So first, what are the graphs? What we're looking at is maize, wheat, and rice. This is the stuff where we humans get most of our calories from. This is what feeds us, right? We're looking at yields in the temperate regions and the tropical regions. This is where most of the food is grown. On the vertical axis, you're looking at the change in yield. So this is if you plant wheat, how many bushels do you get per acre, right? If you're in America. Kilograms per hectare if you're in Europe. And that's given in percentage change, where 0 means no change, positive means crops grow better, negative means crops grow worse. Then the dots that you're looking at are the original studies, and then the curve is a line that is fitted through this. And what you see is roughly what you would expect. So if you look at wheat in the tropics, it's going to do badly, right? And yields may halve, actually, for 5 degrees of warming. So that is a pretty big change in the success of this particular crop. And the reason for that is very simple. Wheat is a cold-loving plant, right? And if you look at rice, which is a crop that likes it hot, you see much smaller changes, still a bit negative, and basically negative here as well. Maize is also a heat-loving plant, and you see much smaller changes. But the size of the change really depends on what you're growing and where you're growing it, right? The size of the input. Now there is a second thing that is going on this graph, and that is the blue line. And the blue dots. So what the red dots and the red line assume is that farmers will continue to do the same thing as they have always done. And this is known as the dumb farmer hypothesis. And there are issues with this. And the one who put it best, I think, is Howie Grunspecht. And what you're looking at here is a picture of a beach. And there's people lying on the beach, sunbathing. Sea is almost flat here, right? But she's very close to the sea. And if sea level were to rise by 1 meter, if sea level were to rise by 50 centimeters, then she would drown, right? Because her head would be underwater, and you can't keep it up for more than a few minutes. So because of sea level rise, because of climate change, she and a lot of other people on this beach would drown. No, of course not, right? Sea level rise is fairly gradual. 0.5 meter of sea level rise we can expect over a century or so. So the chances that she will still be lying there in a century's time are pretty slim, right? People stay on the beach typically 2 to 3 hours, not much longer. the chance that if the water comes in and she doesn't notice is pretty slim, right? The chance that she still be alive in 100 years' time is also pretty slim. And that her grandchildren will insist on sunbathing in the same spot, exact same spot in 100 years' time, even if the beach is washed away because of sea level rise. People aren't that stupid, right? So this is the so-called dumb farmer hypothesis. And Colin Prentice has noticed that it's not the farmer who is dumb, right? It's the analyst who is making the assumption that farmers are dumb. Who is dumb, right? So what would happen, right, if farmers sort of like notice that climate is changing and their crop is not doing as well as it used to? Are they going to insist on planting the same variety at the same time, use the same fertilizers, use the same irrigation, use the same pesticides, and harvest at the exact same time as their father and grandfather did? No, right? Farmers sort of observe what is going on in their fields and change their behavior as they see that things that they used to do don't work anymore, right? So that is the blue dots and the blue lines, where the assumption is that on the farm, farmers respond. And the response that we're looking at here are only changes in crop management. So it's not that farmers will say, wheat is a cold-loving plant, let's grow maize instead. No, that's not what's going on. What's going on here is that they change the time of planting and harvesting and watering and spraying their plants, right? That is what it's saying. And what you see is that if that happens, the large negative effects partially disappear. If we're talking about wheat in the tropics. If we're talking about wheat in the temperate regions, what you see is that a negative turns out to be a positive. Right? Because plants grow better when the growing season is longer. The grain has more time to mature. And so on and so forth. Right? So either the negatives are ameliorated or the negatives turn into positive, right? As I said, rice is a heat-loving plant, and actually it seems to quite like it if you change your management practices. Farmers aren't stupid. They are very likely to do that in response to what's going on. Right, so the blue is always above the red, except for this particular graph. And the reason for that has to do with people not paying attention during statistics class. Right? So the numbers that you're looking at here are the number of studies included in constructing the graph. So the 120 that you see here are the 120 red dots, and the 92 that you see here are the 92 blue dots. And then the curve is just the average of the two. And you immediately know that the way the average is constructed can't be the same because you have a different number of observations, right? So what they should have done is restrict the sample to those studies where you have both a with and without on-farm adaptation. And had they done that, and they did so in a follow-up paper, they admitted just how silly they were. If you correct for the selection bias, then the blue again lies above the red, right? So this is just the geniuses that worked for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not knowing about selection bias. Duh. The picture that you get here is confusing, right? Climate change can be good or can be bad, depending where you farm and what you farm and whether or not you realize the climate has changed and you're doing something about it. One way of integrating sort of this knowledge that we say, well, climate change can be very bad in some places, can be good in other places, can be a little bit good in some places, can be a little bit bad in other places. is to integrate everything into a model of the world agricultural sector. And that is what is going on this picture, where all that information about yield changes is fed into a partial equilibrium model of the agricultural sector. That introduces markets, obviously, so local trade in food products, as well as international trade in these things. But it also introduces farmers who are a little bit smarter than the ones I just showed. It's not just that they can change how they manage their crops, but they can also decide on what to grow. And you see farmers switching from one crop to the other in these models. And then, of course, relative prices change, and it means that consumers also adapt. And it also means that instead of growing wheat in the UK, we can decide to import our wheat and grow more maize instead, right? So those things can happen in these models as well. So this is again an index of climate change. This is an index of how the price of food products changes, and this is a weighted price depending on total consumption. And then the positives denote price increase, and that means that supply must have fallen, right? And the negative one means that supply must have increased and prices fall as a result. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends, of course, whether you're a farmer or whether you're a consumer, right? So the consumers like this bit, where supply is increased and prices have fallen. People who own a farm or people who work on a farm may not be so happy with this, whereas this may well be good for farmers, but it's not so good for consumers, right? So that is also an important thing to keep in mind. Good and bad depends on your perspective. Now there's 5 different studies here, and 2 of them say that climate change is unambiguously bad. From the very beginning, all impacts on supply are negative and impacts on prices are positive. And there's these 2 other studies that, and there's the one in between, and there's these 2 other studies that say, well, initial climate change may actually be a good thing. And after that, it turns bad for crop yields. The difference between these 2 curves and these 2 curves is instructive. They roughly make the same assumptions about substitution elasticities and price elasticities and income elasticities. There is how the market responds to changes, but they make different assumptions about what they include in climate change. These studies just look at temperature and rainfall changes, and a little bit of radiation and wind. These studies also include CO2 fertilization. So what is that, right? So plants grow by photosynthesis. And essentially what plants do when they photosynthesize is that they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they take water out of the soil, mostly, and then they have this reaction where they combine the CO2 from the atmosphere and the H2O from the soil and make that into a carbohydrate. C and H, and the carbohydrates is what make the leaves and the stems and the roots of the plant, right? And then the oxygen, the CO2, and the H2O, the oxygen is a waste product and they dump it back into the atmosphere, right? That is what photosynthesis does. It makes plants grow and it produces oxygen, which is good for us as a waste product. Now, so CO2 is plant food, right? So if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants grow faster. So that is one aspect that's actually not particularly important. The other aspect is that they get the CO2 from the atmosphere. And in order to get the CO2 from the atmosphere, plants open their stomata on their leaves. And stomata can be sort of thought of as little mouths that plants have in order to grab CO2 from the atmosphere. If you have a cold and you sleep with your mouth open, you wake up with a very dry mouth, right? And it's because if you open your mouth, you evaporate water. Plants do the same thing. If they open their stomata, they evaporate water. Now, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, they need to keep their mouths open not so long in order to get the same amount of CO2. And it means that they evaporate less water. And that means that if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants get more water efficient. They get more drought resistant. And that is particularly good for plants, particularly in areas where crop growth is water limited, which is much more important than being CO2 limited. And that lastly explains the difference between the two sets of studies, and that explains why initial climate change is probably good for crop growth, because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, and that means that you need to irrigate less. Right? And you can sort of see the complexity here and the uncertainties associated with these studies, right? Different plants respond differently, different studies make different assumptions about different response rates. And adaptation, how farmers respond to this, is terribly important. But it's not just farmers who are important here, because farmers do not just respond to things that are happening on their farm. Most farms, most agricultural sectors around the world are heavily influenced by regulation and by different forms of price support. And what you're looking at here is a key example of what people have called maladaptation. And what you're looking at is still valid in the UK for another couple of months, is the Common Agricultural Policy and the price support that is given here. And the darker the color, the greater the support for farmers that you see. So farmers here in northern France basically don't get some subsidies, but not a lot. Subsidies are not particularly important. But if you move to the mountains in Portugal, for instance, or in Sweden, what you see is enormously large farm support, right? And essentially what these farm subsidies do is two things. First, they shield farmers from market volatility. And this is not a European thing, this is actually worldwide, that you have a bad harvest and farmers start complaining, and they get compensation essentially from the taxpayer. So that is one thing that farm subsidies do. Essentially, the level of subsidy is negatively correlated with the price. You see that at the moment going on in the US, right, where Trump decided to pick a fight with China. China no longer wanted to buy soybeans from the American Midwest, and now all these farmers are in trouble, and Trump is handing out large subsidies to them to keep the farmers happy. Right? So as soon as something happens in the market, either because of market forces or because of political interventions, the taxpayer sort of foots the bill, right? So these subsidies, not just in Europe but across the world, shield farmers from market volatility. And another thing that the European subsidies do in particular is that they try to equalize farm incomes across the union. Now, what does this imply? This implies that if you are a farmer somewhere in the mountains of Portugal, then it doesn't really matter what you do on your farm. You can do the stupidest things ever. You are gonna get the subsidy. And actually, the more stupid you are, the higher the subsidy. And that means that if you, and actually that is now formalized, that traditional forms of agriculture get higher support than modern forms of agriculture. So if circumstances change and you stick to your guns, you keep on doing what you always used to do, the result is that your crops will fail, but your income doesn't, because you just get more farm support, right? So this reduces the incentive to change as market circumstances or the climate changes. Similarly, with any sort of form of price support, if times are bad, that means that you mute the signal to the farmer, oh God, my crops are failing, I'm not making as much money anymore. No, you see your crops are failing, but you're making just as much money because you get more subsidies. There is less of an incentive to change and try new kinds of crops or new kinds of crop management. Right? A lot of trade policy, I mean, we have liberalized most of our trade in goods across the world. Tariffs are now pretty low almost everywhere, with the main exception of agriculture. Agricultural tariffs are still pretty steep. That essentially means that you keep farming in-house, domestic. You want to grow things in your own country. That's essentially what trade policy does. And that means that you sort of hamper international forms of adaptation. It may be that the best adaptation to climate change is to shift production of a particular crop across borders, but trade barriers would essentially hinder, if not completely prevent it. Right? And this makes adaptation difficult, and as you can see from this graph, the worse the adaptation, the higher the impact. Right? So that is something to keep in mind there. Okay, so that was the second chapter. What would happen to water? Well, lots of things. So in the first week I talked a little bit about changes in rainfall. We'll show that graph again in a minute or so. And what you recall there is that if climate changes, then it's not just that the world gets warmer, but some places will get drier, other places will get wetter, right? So that is something that will change. As a result, you immediately see that your probability on droughts and floods will change. But it's not just that your supply of water, the amount of rainfall will change. It's also, of course, that your demand for water will change. So I talked a little bit about agriculture already. So if climate were to change, then also the demand for irrigation water will change. If it's warmer, you will drink more, and not just you, but all mammals will drink more, and the demand for drinking water will change. And also the demand for cooling water will change, right? So all these things will happen. Some of these things are relatively well understood, other things are not so well understood. This is another graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. By now you may have noticed that I do not particularly like the way they make graphs. This one is also particularly bad because of the color coding. If you're colorblind, you have a problem here, right? Is there anybody colorblind in the room? No, if you're a human, you also have an issue here. So what are we looking at? Actually, it's not restricted to human. What we're looking at here is the change in the return period of the 100-year flood. Now, what is the 100-year flood? The 100-year flood is not the flood that occurs every 100th year, but it's the flood that has every year a probability of occurring of 1%, right? And that's the base situation where this particular flood with this particular amount of water in this particular place occurs with a probability of 1 in 100, right? In blue, you're looking at where the 100-year flood becomes a 50-year flood, becomes a 10-year flood, becomes an almost annual flood, right? So that is blue. Flood frequency increases. And then in red, the 100-year flood becomes the 250-year flood, becomes the 1,000-year flood, right? And there is red areas. Now this map is bad because red means danger and green means safe, right? In this case, red means safe and blue means danger, right? The jokers who came up with this color coding. This is not just a human thing, right? This is.
So it doesn't make sense that red is dry.
Brown is dry.
Maybe red is not just a fire.
It's a flood map. It's not a fire map. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, but that's what the color coding means. So red is good here, right? Red means safe. Blue is bad. So you see an increase in floods where we live, right? The key thing here is, of course, that basically everywhere on the planet you see large changes in flood rates, right? Not, of course, in the Sahara where there's no water to begin with, so flood risk doesn't change. But basically everywhere where there's water, you see major changes. And that means that you have to adjust your flood protection or accept a different risk, right? Basically everywhere. So that is something that will change. Of course, this is just one projection, and different studies would show different things. Then the question becomes, of course, so this is the change in the natural circumstances. How would you actually respond to that? And that is an issue. And it's a particular issue if you're talking about water. Because essentially what you would do is, if you look at climate change and you wonder, so how are we going to respond to this? And you look at the climate science and you look at all the different scenarios, you sort of like see this enormous range of possible futures, right? It can warm by 1 degree, it may warm by 6 degrees by the end of the century. Oh my God, how am I going to respond to this? Now that is actually a silly question to ask, because if you are a farmer in the UK and it's almost March, so you're going to plant your wheat in the next few weeks, you're going to sow your fields, you don't care about the weather in 2050 or the weather in 2100, because your crop is going to grow between March and October, and what matters is the weather over the next 6 months that determines the success of your crop. You're going to harvest the stuff in autumn, so what do you care about what the weather will be next year, let alone in a century from now? It's completely irrelevant for the success of your crop, right? So for those things that have a quick turnover, the uncertainty about future climate doesn't matter. If you are designing a bridge, say, and the bridge will need to last for 100 years' time, and you want to make sure that the bridge will function still by the end of the century. You're a good engineer rather than one who signs off and retires. You care about your product, and the reason that you need to worry about the functioning of infrastructure that has metal in it is because metal expands as it gets warmer and it shrinks as it gets colder. And what we see in a couple of places in Europe, that in very hot days those bridges won't open anymore because the metal has expanded so much that it just doesn't work. Which is an issue if you're on a ship and you want to get through the bridge, right? And what we've also seen in recent hot years is that bridges would open but they wouldn't close anymore, which is an issue if you're in your car and you're trying to cross, right? But the good thing about this is you may not, you want your bridge to function in 100 years' time. You do not know whether it will warm at 1 degree or at 6 degrees. But you do know it will warm, right? So what you do is you just make sure that the bridge will function in the most extreme scenario, right? And that's within your engineering expertise to redesign your bridges such that it works, right? Same is true for tarmac, and same is true for concrete, and so on and so forth. They all respond to temperature. If you are responding to rainfall, you have an additional issue, and I talked about this in the first week, and that is that in some places like England it gets wetter in winter and drier in summer, and in other places, that's all the shaded areas, models actually cannot agree whether it will get wetter or drier. What you know is that rainfall will be different in the future, but you don't know how. And often in many places, you actually don't even know the sign of the change, let alone its magnitude. And that is a challenge, right? That is a challenge if you are designing something, an irrigation system or something, or a flood protection system that is supposed to last 100 years. What are you going to do, right? And essentially, there's two options you have there. Either you can build your system so that it can withstand anything, right? Cooling, warming, drying, wettening, all those things you can cope with. That works sometimes, but it doesn't work always. And what we see at the moment, because we just had these floods and there's all these jokers out on telly saying it's the EU's fault because they prevented us from draining the rivers, and that's why we have all these floods, right? It's not the EU that told us not to drain rivers, right? One. But second, if you drain rivers, then yes, water flows faster to the sea, which is great if you have a flooding problem. But in summer, the water also flows faster to the sea, which is not so great if you have a drought problem in summer, right? So draining the rivers is actually, in a situation like the UK, a pretty stupid thing to do. Because yes, you reduce your flood problem in winter, but you also exacerbate your drought problem in summer. And the thing that they're doing in England at the moment is build retention areas, right? Where you divert the water to places where there are no houses. So you mitigate your flood problem, but without exacerbating your drought problem in summer. So that is, for a situation like the UK or like England, is probably a better option and very successfully implemented. If you want to see those retention areas, travel to Lewis, where half of the country is underwater. Go ahead. But the town is dry.
Is it trouble with the upgrade in the drought? Every year there's more risk of turning being more harmful than drought.
Why do you say so?
Well, I live in Gloucestershire, so maybe it's quite bad.
Mm-hmm.
my direct experience is that they will constantly
That's because we fairly successfully avoid the drought, right? Now, I don't know about Gloucestershire. I do know about Sussex.
For example, Wales
right?
is now flooded.
Yes.
Whereas I don't remember hearing about droughts in South.
That's because they manage very well, very expensively. Now, what you may not have noticed is that last summer, the reservoirs that provide drinking water to Brighton were almost dry. Almost, right? And it's not just that they stopped farmers irrigating, which is something that you would not notice because food gets slightly more expensive. And you just import food from France and Poland and those sort of places, so you would not notice as a consumer. But we were almost at the point that we had to restrict drinking water. And then I don't mean drinking water for washing your car or for watering your garden, but I mean drinking water for drinking. We're almost at the point of restricting that. Won't happen this summer because the reservoirs are overflowing at the moment, right, as you may have noted. But you're obviously right that if you don't have a drought problem in summer, then draining the rivers is a brilliant idea, right? Because then you dump the water in the sea and it's harmless there, basically harmless there. So then you have a solution, but oftentimes summer and winter want you to do different things. So building more flexibility into the system, rather than casting everything in concrete and say it's like this for the next 100 years, you just want to build flexibility into your system. Right? You want to design your system so that in 20 years' time, as you've learned more, circumstances have changed, you can go back and change it without ripping out everything. So that's the sort of thing that you want to do. If you ask engineers to do this, they are thrilled, right? This is an intellectual challenge to engineers, that they can design a system that doesn't just work in the current climate, but also in all possible future climates. That's an intellectual challenge, and they go to town on that, right? So it's not an issue that can't be solved, it's just something that you need to give the people who design your systems the right incentives to actually do so. And again, things can go wrong there. What the UK government did for a long time is, rather than ask designers and engineers to cope with any particular climate change in the future, they said the climate projections by the Hadley Centre in Exeter are correct, and you should be able, your design should be able to withstand the projected climate according to the Hadley Centre. Forget about the climate centre in Hamburg, they don't know anything. Forget about the climate centre at Princeton, they don't know anything. As long as your design works fine under the official UK projection of what climate change will be in the future, you are fine as an engineer, right? And if you actually go beyond it and say, oh, perhaps the guys in Exeter don't know quite so well what's going to happen in the future, because the future is hard to predict, then you're actually in trouble as an engineer, right? So there's issues there with how you design and how you incentivize things. But if you ask engineers, then they will solve this particular problem. I talked about nature, I talked about agriculture, I talked about water. I'm going to skim quickly through these three or next couple of issues, and then I'm going to talk about human health a little bit longer. So, climate change also affects energy production and energy use. Energy use is trivial, right? If it gets warmer in winter, you need less heating. If it gets warmer in summer, you need more air conditioning and cooling. Energy production is less obvious to most people. Obviously, if climate changes, then your solar panels will behave differently and the wind turbines behave differently. But also your thermal plants, your coal-fired, gas-fired power plants behave differently as well. Actually, if it's warmer, the resistance on your power lines increases, so that is an issue. The bigger issue with energy production for thermal plants is cooling water. Essentially, these things are big furnaces, right? You heat things, and you do that, they tend to overheat. So what you do in a coal-fired power plant, or a nuclear power plant for that matter, is that you pour cold water in to keep your equipment from breaking. Now there's two issues with climate change there. One is that your cooling water will be warmer and therefore less effective as a coolant. There may also be shortages of cooling water, and that means that your plants can't work anymore. But there's more immediate issues as well, leading me back to the issue of adaptation. And what we're currently seeing in hot summers in France is that they have to shut down the nuclear power plants because of restrictions on cooling water. Now that is not so much an issue in France at the moment, because in France the peak demand for electricity, as in England, is in winter, just before Christmas, when it's dark and cold. Actually, that is where our demand for electricity peaks. So having to shut down power generating capacity in summer is not so much of a problem. If you look at Florida or California, the peak demand for electricity is actually in summer because of all the air conditioning. And then having to shut down your power plants is an issue. Now, why do they have to shut down these power plants? Not so much because the cooling water isn't effective, but because of restrictions on the return water. So what you do is you take cold water from the river, you put it on your power plant, it cools down, but then of course your cooling water becomes warmer, and that warmer water you dump back into the river. So that is what you do. And now that warmer water has ecological implications, and at the moment those are the restrictions, that you cannot put water that is too hot back into the river because it would kill fish and those sort of things. So this is not so much a physical constraint, but it's a legal constraint. Right? And in the future, Macron will have to decide, do I plunge Paris into darkness, or do I allow damage to the fish in the rivers of France? Right? And you can sort of guess what Macron, or rather his successor, will decide. Right? But again, the human response here, or rather the response of the government, is particularly important. Tourism is obviously affected by climate change, right? The reason that we like to have our holidays in Spain is because the weather is nice there. But what you see at the moment is that a lot of Northern Europeans would rather not go to southern Italy or Greece in August because it's too hot. These are wonderful places in May and in September, but they're too hot for Germans, English people in August and July. And you would see more of that in those places. Tourism demand would shift to the so-called shoulder season. Right? At the same time, what you could expect is that the English south coast or the German Baltic coast would become much more attractive for summer tourism than they are now. Right? So you could expect, because of climate change, major shifts in where people would take their holidays. Now, this doesn't matter so much for the tourists, right? What you care about is that you have a nice holiday, not that you went to Spain, right? What matters is the holiday. It also doesn't matter a whole lot for the tourist suppliers, right? EasyJet doesn't care whether they sell you a ticket to Hamburg or a ticket to Bordeaux, right? As long as you fly with them, they're fine. The issue is also not so much with the main sort of resorts, because these are typically international companies, multinational companies, because tourism tastes are quite fickle, they depreciate their assets pretty rapidly anyway, and they don't care whether they build up a new resort in Germany or in Greece. But the locals who really depend on the jobs, they may be the ones that are most affected by these changes, right? So that is an issue. Construction is an issue. In weather like this, it's hard to build. If it's very cold, it's hard to build. Transport is an issue, right? And snowstorms and everything. Disrupt transport, but also I talked a little bit about bridges and wouldn't close and so on and so forth. So there's this long list of impacts that are perhaps not immediately obvious. What I'm going to talk about a little bit longer are the impacts on human health. So I'll get back to the vector-borne diseases, malaria and such, later, in 2 weeks' time or in 3 weeks' time. But I'm going to talk a little bit about heat stress at the moment. Now, heat stress may not occur to you at this very moment as a big issue, but it actually is, right? So we are warm-blooded animals, and our body, the organs in our body, require a temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius. And if it gets too cold, our organs shut down, and if it gets too warm, our organs shut down as well. So we have a pretty sophisticated regulatory system to make sure that our core temperature stays around the 37 degrees. That implies that if our surroundings are too cold, we are in trouble, and you start to shiver and those sort of things. That's a way of keeping things warmer, and that works reasonably fine unless essentially your body needs to work to keep itself warm, and if your heart is weak, if you have a cardiovascular problem, you are in trouble. And what we see is that cold stress can cause serious trouble in people with heart problems. Heat stress is also an issue. What do you do when it gets hot? You start to sweat, right? That is your main cooling system. So you lose water, you evaporate that water, and in the process of evaporation, you cool your body. Now that also requires work, and again your body works harder if it is very hot. Now for you guys, you all are young and you look healthy to me. This is not a big deal. You are tired during a heat wave, right? Because your body works to cool itself all the time. But other than that, you come out fine. If you are very young, babies under 6 months old can't sweat. They are in trouble. If you're very old and your heart doesn't work so well anymore, you are in trouble. Or if you have some sort of pre-existing condition with your heart or your lungs for that matter, you are also in trouble. So heat stress is particularly severe on the very young, the very old, and the sick. For younger people, this is actually an issue. Labor productivity falls during very hot times. And that is simply because your body gets tired. Particularly hot nights tire people, and also because we cool ourselves from sweating. If humidity is high, if there's a lot of water in the air already, you cannot evaporate water. because there's nothing to evaporate to, and that also makes you particularly tired. Those impacts on labor productivity are quite severe. 2-3 degrees of warming in places like Southeast Asia could cut labor productivity by 30 to 40%. Now, you recall from micro that to a first approximation, the money you earn is proportional to your labor productivity, right? So if labor productivity falls by 30%, your first guess would be that your income falls by 30%, right? So that is quite a big impact, and that's because it's so very humid already, right? And so very hot already, and sweatshops really become sweatshops. But also if you're not young and healthy, this can have severe health impacts. Their cold stress thing is positive, right? Warmer winters would lead to less cold stress, so that is a good thing. Warmer summers would lead to more heat stress, so that is a bad thing, right? And it really depends where you are, which of the two is bigger. Actually, I've got to say one thing about cold stress. It's not so much the thermal shock that does it. Only a few people die each year of cold exposure, that they essentially freeze to death, and mostly drunk people who forget to put on the coat and forget to go back inside, right? Those are the sort of people who die of acute cold stress. But what we also see in winter is actually that there's a lot of flu and those sort of things that also carries off a lot of people. And those things have not so much to do with a direct physiological response to the cold, but with the fact that during winter we spend more time indoors, we spend more time closer to other people, and that means that infectious diseases have much more chance to get hold of the population. You could expect that if it gets warmer in winter, people would spend at a greater distance from each other. So, let's return to heat stress, and let's turn to the proper role of the different actors in adaptation. So if it's very hot outside, I should heat it in summer, right? That's much easier to imagine. What you should do is wear little clothes, right? You should stay calm, you should keep out of the sun, and you should drink lots, right? Those are the things that you should do during a heat wave. You shouldn't drink alcohol, because alcohol actually opens your pores and you evaporate more water, but you should drink lots. You should drink lots of non-alcoholic drinks. And those are the sort of things that you need to do when it's very hot. And you know this, right? This is something that you picked up when you were 5 or 6. Once you have kids, you realize that kids under, say, a 4-year-old toddler would not know these things. And if you're a parent, you need to make these decisions for them, because they don't make the connection between being hot and wearing their winter coat. But you guys do, right? This is a private decision that you make, and you're perfectly capable of doing so. And even if you're English, you should keep out of the sun, right? If you talk to people who grew up in Italy or Spain, they know that the sun is something to avoid. If you grew up in England, then you may not realize this, but really when it gets hot, you should just stay out of the sun. So this is a purely private decision, right? And Boris Johnson can stick his head on telly and tell you during a heat wave, drink water and keep out of the sun, but those sort of interventions are typically not particularly effective, right? So this is something that you as a private individual decide. It is not to say that it's a purely private matter, right? There are things that are adaptations to hot weather that are collective. Sleeping during the hottest days, the hottest hours of the day is actually an adaptation to heat. It's not that people in Spain are lazy or anything. This is actually to make sure that you don't do much during the hottest period of the day. And of course, having a siesta only works if everybody has a siesta. If you're the only one who has a siesta and all your neighbors are making lots of noise, it doesn't really help. Also, you guys have to go to class during those times, right? So it's not just a matter of you deciding now is a good time to have a siesta, but actually your schedule should allow for it. So those are not private decisions, but collective decisions. Similarly, late dinner. It actually takes a lot of energy to digest your food and then heats up your body. So people in Spain are actually perfectly right to have their main meal at 10 in the evening if you're in Barcelona, or at midnight if you're in Valencia, right? That's an adaptation to the heat. And that, of course, is also not a private decision that you make, because restaurants need to be open at that time, right? But yeah, all these things can be done. But this is how you should respond to the heat. Most of this is private, right? The government has nothing to do with this. But that is not to say that there is no role for the government here. So in 2003, when you were 5 or 6, there was an enormous heat wave, and you do not recall this. 43,000 people died in France alone during this heat wave. So people always go on about 9/11, right, when they flew these planes into the Twin Towers. 9,000 people were killed that day. It's a major thing, and it changed geopolitics. In France, 43,000 people died during this one incident, and it seems to have disappeared from memory, right? Even though humans were quite to blame. So what happened in France was that, it was a heat wave in August. Lots of people, particularly older people, had people with respiratory problems, particularly people with cardiovascular problems, reported all sorts of symptoms of acute heat stress. And they turned up at their doctors, they turned up at their hospitals, and were essentially turned away and died subsequently rather than being treated. The reason for this is that it was August in France. And in August, all French people are on holiday, including lots of doctors and nurses. And there was no mechanism in place to say, look guys, we have an emergency at home, come back from your holidays. There was simply no protocols in place. And the only person who could overrule the protocols and call everybody back was the Minister of Health. And he was on holiday, and he did not bother to read the newspapers of what was going on in France, and 43,000 people died, right? That guy should have been locked up for crimes against humanity, but no, he wasn't. He got a fat pension. So there's a very clear public role here. Right? This is no longer, if it gets so hot, it's no longer the case that you should wear less clothes or you should drink more water. No, the public health system should respond to this as well. I said that this is largely forgotten. Actually, health systems across Europe and across the world have learned from this experience. And the NHS now has a heat plan, right? That prevents these things from happening. And we've come through a good few heat waves since without causing this much trouble. But there's a clear role for the government here, right? There's another thing that you can do, and this is something that came out of Chicago and heat waves in the early 90s there. So what happened, it was very hot. Poor people sought relief from the heat, and they did not have air conditioning at home. They instead went to the shopping mall, which is typically air conditioned, and they were thrown out. because the security guards in the shopping mall have as very clear instructions that anybody who is not obviously shopping has no place in the shopping mall, and they just threw a lot of them out, and a good few of them died. So again, there is the private adaptation here is clear, right? It's hot outside, let's find a cool spot. There is also a public role here, and that is to make sure that security guards have the right instructions, because security guards are not sort of highly intelligent, highly trained people that can make these decisions for themselves. You should tell them when it's 30 degrees or warmer outside, and then you should allow the oldies into the shopping mall, right? In Philly, another heat wave. Lots of people died during the heat wave, and in the post-mortem, what they found was that people were in their apartments. They had a fan, but they did not turn on the fan. They had windows, but they did not open the windows. And essentially they stayed in their rooms and were slowly cooked to death. Why? Well, those who survived were interviewed, and it turned out that some people were simply, yes, they had a fan, but they could not afford the electricity. So the public response here would be to give vouchers or price subsidies or something to make sure that people can afford electricity, waive their electricity bills if necessary during summer, right? The people who did not open their windows were typically people who were living on the ground floor, and they were so afraid of the crime in the neighborhood that if they opened the window, a burglar or a murderer could get in and kill them, and they'd rather die by heat exposure. So again, there is a mix here of private incentives and public incentives. And the role of the public here is that during heat waves, you should have more police on the street to provide that sense of security, right? Of course, that goes in the UK, in Philly, we send more police on the street. People may start feeling less safe, but let's assume that the police is on our side for a moment, right? And you want to do that anyway, right? Because there's two more things that happen during heat waves. And first is that people get more aggressive. So what you see happening during heat waves is that lots of people on the street, your neighbors make a lot of noise, and typically you think of that as annoying, but that's it. When it's very hot, then more people are inclined to go out and knock them over the head. You see more violent crime during heat waves. And that has probably to do with impulse control. It seems the case that during your brain gets too hot, you become more primitive and you act on your impulses and you start hitting people. The same is true for sexual crime, that you see more of that during heat waves. And by now the evidence is that this has nothing to do with the amount of young women on the street. This has nothing to do with the clothes that they're wearing during heat waves. This has everything to do with males not being able to control their urges as well during heat waves. And that is another reason to have more police officers on the street. So, guys, you have been warned now, right? During hot times, you may lose control over yourself. Don't be that asshole. Okay, so a mixture of private and public incentives, right? The final thing I want to talk about, God, is sea level rise. So if ocean water gets warmer, it expands. We talked about it in the first week, and that means that the sea level rises, and there's also a little bit of ice melt going on. and that leads to, if you don't do anything about it, leads to a loss of land, or if you want to do something about it, higher costs for dike building and seawalls and so on and so forth. So that is pretty obvious. Most people would realize that. Wetlands are in trouble as well. So coastal wetlands, what they will do, if sea level rises, is essentially they migrate inland. So if sea level rises, sort of the sea sides of the coastal wetland drowns, but then in return it encroaches on the land and it grows on the land side of the coastal wetland. And then it just depends on sediment balances and the speed of sea level rise and so on and so forth what would happen. But there's another issue there, and that is that often that land is occupied by farmers or cities and they put up coastal defenses, and then the coastal wetland has no place to go, right? And it essentially shrinks and drowns. And the final thing that is important about sea level rise is saltwater intrusion. So we have fresh water on the land, we have salt water in the ocean, and there is a balance between the two near the coast, right, where essentially you have an area of brackish water, but in groundwater the divide is slightly sharper, has to do with the pressure of the sea. Now if sea level rises, then the wedge between salt water and fresh water moves inland, also for the groundwater, and that is called saltwater intrusion. This is not so much an issue if you have a rocky coast as we do here. It is more of an issue if you have a flat deltaic coast, then the saltwater can intrude actually quite a bit, and it's a big issue if you're a small atoll. So a lot of people worry about what the sea level rise do to a country like Tuvalu or something. It's essentially a couple of atoll islands. The highest point is 1 meter above sea level rise, and people worry about the country entirely disappearing underwater in 100 years' time or so. That is actually not their main concern. Their drinking water is essentially derived from groundwater, and they have a freshwater bell under the atoll, and that is what feeds their plants and what provides their drinking water. If sea level rises, more salt water will intrude into that, and the freshwater bell will turn brackish not in a century or so, but by 2030 or by 2040. So long before these islands disappear under the sea, they will lose all their freshwater and therefore all the life that depends on freshwater. This is a much more urgent issue for them than anything. Now, what can we do about sea level rise? Essentially, we can protect ourselves, right? And that matters, and this is, and then I'm going to turn to the next thing here. What we're seeing here is a slightly complicated picture. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at sea level rise. This is the current situation. On this axis, and that's a logarithmic axis, we're looking at the number of people flooded, measured in millions per year. This is not the number of people drowning. This is not the number of people who get very wet. This is just the number of people who get wet, right? If you just get your toes wet, that counts as much as if you get your nose wet. And what we see is if we pick this particular scenario, is that the current number of people flooded is around 50 million people per year, and with 1 meter sea level rise that would go up to 600 or 700 million. So that's an order of magnitude increase. So that sounds quite serious, right? But then, this assumes that we keep the dikes and the seawalls as they are. So this is the Dome coastal manager hypothesis, right? In the dashed line, the assumption is that we do not keep the flood protection as they are, but we keep the flood protection standards as they are. So at the moment, the Thames barrier protects London against the 1 in 1,000-year flood. If you leave the Thames barrier as it is, then it will reduce its protection level to maybe 1 in 200 years. In this scenario here, we assume that the replacement of the Thames barrier will be as good in protection terms as the current Thames barrier, right? And then what you see is their impacts are full. But then if you look at the dotted line, there's a different assumption again. And that is, if you look across the world, and you look at a place like London, it's actually fairly well protected, 1 in 1,000 years, I just told you, against storms and tides. If you go to a place like Lagos or Abidjan, there's hardly any coastal protection. Mumbai is another example of a place that is very vulnerable to sea level rise and to current storms and tides. And the question is, why? Well, the difference there is obviously income. People in London are rich enough to build a thing, and smart enough to build a thing like the Thames barrier, whereas people in Abidjan don't do that, right? Because they can't afford one. Now, if you recall the scenarios that we looked at in the second week, it's actually rapid economic growth everywhere, and that is what drives climate change, right? So in the future, it will not only be warmer and sea level will not only be higher, but people will also be a lot richer. So in the dotted curve, we assume that as people become richer, they will also demand better protection against floods and are better able to afford to pay for that protection. And then you're in this line. And what you see is this is also an order of magnitude, right? Instead of the 500 million, we have 50 million again. So all of this is terribly important. Now, you wonder what is going on here, right? Why don't we start at the same point? And that is because the people who built these models did not have data and did not have the wherewithal to calibrate properly. And in this case, I am one of the co-authors, so I'm now making fun of myself, right? But the issue here is that adaptation is, again, it's the same order of magnitude as the signal of climate change, right? So, the paper I wanted you to read is also about sea level rise. And it's the Northern European Enclosure Dam. And this was a paper that was published 2 weeks ago in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. Who read the paper? Yay! What does the paper do?
Basically, like talking about a dam that is built from Scotland to Norway and then from Cornwall to France. And I didn't read it all of it very long, but I sort of took away that it's more sort of water turning rather than like a genuine idea. They're trying to kind of illustrate that if we do nothing, this is what we have to do. So I think it's kind of to say we definitely don't want to do this, and the solution is still not happening.
There's like 25 million people in those areas, or they're displacing the government people basically very difficult to do. So it's highlighting the idea that although there are alternatives that might not be that difficult, and this could genuinely be one of the more sort of logistically
So the assumption here is very little action in terms of emission reduction. And as a result, sea level rise will not stop at 1 meter or 2 meter or 5 meters, but it will go upward to 10 meters or maybe higher, right? And then the question is, what are you going to do? So this guy here, the way to pronounce his name is Kruskom, but you can try some other pronunciation. So why would he build the dikes there? What's the alternative to building a dike from Cornwall to Brittany and from Scotland to this is the Pilot, right? This is Shetland. So from Scotland to Shetland and from Shetland to Norway. Why would you put the dike there?
Because it encompasses the main sort of coastal areas of those countries. The southern part of England and then western sides of France.
Well, I'm assuming they all try to Europe up to sort of what so it's not back in the whole church.
Yes. The alternative to building a dam here and here and here is to build a dam here, right? So that all this is vulnerable coast, and you would have to build a much longer dike, and you need to build a dike in East Anglia as well. Scotland is not so much very rocky coast, pretty steep. But East Anglia is pretty low lying, right? So the alternative to building dams here is to essentially build a dam here. It's much, much longer, right? So that's one of the first rules of coastal protection, is to shorten your coastline. And the way to shorten your coastline is to bang, 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 rather than follow the existing coast. So what immediate problems do you see?
Well, I don't know about it, but also the western side of the UK obviously doesn't have any protection. I mean, some of it's higher on Wales and some of it's higher. Some of it's just still exposed to the sea. I'm not sure if does that matter or not? I don't know anything about it.
Do you care about the people in Liverpool?
I mean, probably should, yeah. I imagine something would have to happen to the western coast of the UK.
So, my immediate response was build a dam here and build a dam here too, right? And if you're going to do this, do it properly. Again, the west coast of Ireland is rocky and steep, like the cliffs of Moher are 300 meters high. So that would be my immediate response, right? Do this, now build not a porous bridge, but build a porous dam. Dams need to be wide in order to hold the pressure of the water. So if you're going to build a dam, you can put a highway on, right? And a train line, no problem. Because that's how wide these things need to be in. What other problems do you see? So? Yeah? Not that much, but then there's some floating. But no, you can do that. The alternative is to build a much longer and more expensive dam around here. And if you build a dam to protect London, then you need eminent domain to get people out, you need to compensate the landowners and so on and so forth. It's very expensive. Land here is cheap. Right? Land is free. So yes, this is expensive, but not nearly as expensive as the alternative. Right?
Who would do with technically to build it?
But that's why we have engineers. This guy is actually not an engineer. Engineers love this sort of thing, right?
It's a fishing into the right thing. Both people can't be moved. That's the way.
Problem is that this is a closed dam, right? That's the whole point, to keep the water out. What are you going to do with the rivers?
So if you have a dam there, is that all the water within the enclosed water, is that still, that stays there some period of time?
Yes.
Or-
So the North Sea would become a freshwater lake, right? With major implications for nature, right? And you would need to pump. You would need to pump the rivers over the dam. So you need a big pump here and a big pump there. We actually don't talk much about this paper. We did do calculations a long time ago with just the Rhine. And if you want to pump the Rhine over a 5-meter dam, you need 2 nuclear power plants to provide enough energy. And this is the Rhine, and the Scheldt, and the Meuse, and the Thames, and the big river. Weser, Oder? Yeah, Weser, Oder. Thames, you probably need 20 nuclear power plants to pump the water out. Right? I think it's to keep the sea away. The rivers will still come, so this will fill up, right?
But wouldn't it kind of just level itself out? Is there not like...
Yes, it would, but at a level that is 5 meters above now, you still have the problem that we're trying to avoid.
You need to build a dam on the other side, because isn't there then free flowing water into the right? Don't you understand how having it there stops?
Yeah, well, that's
Well,
what
there's-
that's what it just seems so crazy.
The European watershed is here, right? So everything that falls sort of like north of this line goes to the North Sea. Every drop of water that falls to the south of this line goes to the Black Sea. In the Danube.
What about all up like the Baltic area?
Yeah, all goes in here. All that water flows into here. So that is an issue, right? But the same is true if you build a dike here, right? And you still need to pump the river into the sea. How would you solve your harbors?
I'll show you still need boats to go out to the west, which you probably will.
Mhm.
The ports would be part of
Yes. So I know my continental harbors, like Rotterdam, Bremen, Hamburg, Antwerp are 4 of the largest harbors in Europe. I don't know where Felixstowe is. I do know that Southampton is here, right, to the Isle of Wight. London is also a pretty sizable port. Where is Felixstowe? I don't know either, right?
Where's that?
It's the biggest container harbour of the UK.
What's it called?
Felixstowe? I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere here. All those harbours essentially lose their function, right? Because the ships can't come in. So it's useless to have a port that the boats can't reach, right? So you would need to build a new deep sea terminal that replaces all European harbors, all northern European harbors, probably somewhere out of Bristol. It's good for people in Bristol, right? It will be as big as Hamburg, Rotterdam, Bremen, Antwerp, Southampton, London combined, right? And then you would presumably put a freight line on this dam to get your goods onto the continent, right?
So is this actually his idea?
Yes, it's his idea. as far as I know. So far, there's no political buy-in whatsoever. But it strikes me as the simplest alternative, right? And you immediately see the scale, right? You immediately see the scale of, and all the problems that come with it. You need all these countries to agree, right? And they all need to chip in their fair share. And France will of course say, well, I have a steep rocky coast, so I don't care, but I have to go with all the stuff that comes out. The English of course want their sovereignty, and unless the Dems are blue, they may not want them, and so on and so forth, right? So you immediately see the difficulties. The alternative for 10 meters of sea level rise.
When would you want it built?
Oh, the next couple of decades. The alternative, 10 meters sea level rise, is to give up East Anglia and large parts of London, right?
That makes more sense.
You don't like East Anglia.
I just think that this seems like a really bad idea.
I think if someone said do that, or we want to do that,
This is the sort of project that somebody would come up with if they are technocrats, unconstrained by political issues, unconstrained by borders, and say, well, if I want to solve the problem, this is the solution.
It was quite easy to see geography lines on back and forth, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we express it, then it's going to have like you can have that.
Well, I guess that was just like the same as you do it all with the sequence, and you do that every which is you get a huge like sort of economies of scale of this it's crazy for it to make sense.
Right. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, right? I'm not saying that this should happen, right? But this is the sort of things that you should think about, right? When you're talking about adaptation to climate change. That something will be radically different, right? So one alternative is to build it like here. The other alternative is to give up most of the Netherlands, large parts of northern Germany, large parts of the east of England, right? Just give it up to the sea, right? That's an alternative, which is just as radical, right? Say bye-bye East Anglia. It's also a very radical thing to do. So, there's no right answer here, but there are important questions.